Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the video. In this video, me as my official MCU ranking. Now, I know this one's been a long time coming. I've been doing my MCU rewatch for almost the last year. I think I started it in May and now it's December. I'm finally here to give you guys my full ranking of the entire MCU. Before we get into it, if you guys are new here, make sure that subscribe button to notification on so every same time I upload a video where I go live. But let's get more time. Let's get into it. So starting it off in last place is Thor: The Dark World. I don't have much to say about this one. I'm just not the biggest fan of it. And the next one is actually Thor, and I just want to say that both of the Thor movies have good side characters. I'm not going to say great because there's some characters Natalie Portman, there's some characters that just aren't the best in my opinion, and they really drag down a lot of the movie because the movie tries to focus on them a lot when they're not really that cool to me. Next up is Captain Marvel. I actually think Captain Marvel is not a bad movie at all. I just don't really enjoy it because I don't really like the character of Captain Marvel in this movie. In Avengers Endgame, she's actually pretty decent, but in this movie I have to say the highlight is Goose or Nick Fury. She just doesn't really stand out to me. She's just kind of annoying. But next up is Iron Man 2. I think Iron Man 2 and Captain Marvel aren't really that close, but Iron Man 2 is pretty close to the one that's next up. Iron Man 2 just has way too much going on. It has the introduction of Natasha, the big introduction of basically S.H.I.E.L.D., Nick Fury, and the biggest issue with it is just it feels like it's the one movie truly trying to fit everything to explain the future of the MCU, I guess. Like Iron Man obviously is the origin movie for the MCU. It's the baseline, but it's not overridden. I think another thing obviously that goes into that is two villains. I'll talk about this more later, but Iron Man 3 had two villains and I like that one a lot more than this, but I still don't think they're crazy far apart. Now the movie that's next up is Black Widow. This is one of the more recent movies, the first movie in phase 4. I'm just not a big fan of this because it's just a basic action movie. You can tell it's super CGI heavy and it's not like they tried to make it like undercover. Like they did some massive stunt sequences even at the end of the movie. Comparing it to Winter Soldier, for example, the ending of Winter Soldier was actually really entertaining because it kind of felt more realistic. Like when they're fighting on the ship, they weren't skydiving and stuff. In Black Widow, there's skydiving through the sky and they're just like throwing punches, and then there's like a little standoff at the end where then Natasha hugs Taskmaster. And not to mention Taskmaster and the dude that looks like Danny DeVito, they suck as villains. Taskmaster was so poorly done in the MCU and I really hope they bring her character back for something better. The next movie is Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now I cannot defend this movie. I really do love Ant-Man 1, but Ant-Man and the Wasp is such a downgrade story-wise. Now story-wise, I guess, I mean just like basic plot-wise, Ant-Man and Ant-Man and the Wasp are fairly similar. They're not too different. Ant-Man and the Wasp is just a chase and heist movie, whereas Ant-Man 1 is just a heist movie. But what makes Ant-Man 1 so much better is the villain, and I'll be talking about Ant-Man 1 way more later in this video. But Ant-Man and the Wasp, the villain just sucks, and there's really no good characterization for the other villains. Like the other guy who's trying to get the lab, he's just not that good of a character. But I will say Ant-Man and the Wasp does do Scott Lang's character pretty good. I like what they do with Hope, and I also like what they do with Hank Pym. Also, Janet is okay. I don't think she's really that good. I feel like her character isn't built up enough for me to actually be like, let's go save her in the quantum realm. Like I don't care enough about her, but you can feel the heart in Hope and Hank in order to go get Janet. So I do appreciate that effort, and just overall the core cast of characters is good. It's just the villain and then the other dude and then Lawrence Fishburne's character, they're just not really that good. But nevertheless, moving on, the next movie on the list is Iron Man 3. Now like I said before, Iron Man 3 and Iron Man 2, they're not drastically different, but one thing I think Iron Man 3 is going for is that it's not an absolutely absurd amount of things going on. I think that obviously that works in its favor. I like the Mandarin twist, especially after Shang-Chi. I can appreciate the Mandarin twist more, but most importantly, I like how it utilizes Robert Downey Jr.'s acting skills, because in all the other movies, he never really feel like he's a 100% emotionally driven character, but in this movie, you can feel the suffering and guilt within himself. You feel this in the beginning of Endgame as well, but in this movie, it's for a lot of the movie where Iron Man feels like he is a distraught character because of the events of Endgame and how he has PTSD. Yeah, I just think it's interesting, and I really love the way that they use PTSD in this movie. movie and how they use his character to kind of move forward, I guess, the story of the entire MCU, but also like make us appreciate the characters of these heroes more, showing us how they suffer due to these massive events. But next up is Captain America: The First Avenger. Now, before rewatch, I wasn't the biggest fan of this movie. I would definitely say it's in the bottom half of the MCU still, but I still don't think it's that bad. I think where it has its biggest fault is Red Skull as the villain. Now, a lot of the MCU solo origin movies suffer from this. The villain is just very lackluster. The only one first origin story movie that I would say doesn't have a bad villain is Shang-Chi. Iron Man doesn't have a bad villain, and neither does Ant-Man, but they're just not like top tier. I think Wenwu is top tier. Captain America: The First Avenger, I have a little fanboy right of it that I would love to have seen, and that would be basically Captain America having to fight another army of humans and seeing what he would do in that situation. Would he go ahead and kill a bunch of humans in war when they really did nothing wrong to him personally? I don't know how it would turn out, but I just think that's a pretty cool idea. But next up, and this one's pretty surprising for me because after my first watch of this, I thought it was one of the best MCU movies, but now after rewatch, I don't like it as much, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I think the first Guardians of the movie is one of the best movies in the entire MCU, but Guardians Volume 2 really just starts to fall apart when the Guardians are split up, and I think that's obviously the biggest fault of this movie. But I also feel like Ego is just not I just don't think he's a likable enough villain. Like, there's a lot of villains in the MCU where it's like you somehow connect to them in some way, shape, or form. You connect to them, but in this movie, it's like Ego, it's like you can connect to the father-son relationship, but Ego as a character, there's really no substance there. He's just a big dude who's basically a planet who killed Star-Lord's mom, but other than that, there's not much. I also don't understand how this movie would have topped Guardians 1 anyway. Now, next up is actually Spider-Man Far From Home. I personally enjoy this movie. I think it's a fun teenage rom-com, but as a Spider-Man movie, it just really isn't enough for me. I think it's a cool Peter Parker story, and I've seen this movie like 3 times in theaters. I've seen it a few times at home, and not including this rewatch, and so I enjoy the movie again. I think it's a fun time, but just as a Peter Parker, as a Spider-Man movie, I wanted way more. But nevertheless, I'll talk about it more when I compare it to Spider-Man Homecoming later on in this video. But now I want to talk about Iron Man. That's my next movie on the list, and I really like this one. I'm surprised it's this low on my list, but I rewatched it after rewatching it for the MCU rewatch, and I realized like it's not anything super crazy. And I think what really divides Iron Man to the rest of the first origin solo movies in the MCU is that Iron Man, it just feels like I'm so disconnected from the villain, because obviously the movie focuses on Tony Stark in the basically origin of the MCU so much that I don't feel a lot for the villain, whereas the Winter Soldier, Wenwu, Yellow Jacket, Kaisili, it's just all these other villainous characters that are basically the opposites I care for a lot more. Nevertheless, I think Iron Man is still a really good movie, and I would say from Iron Man up, all of these movies are ones that I would 100% recommend. Maybe not the next one though, because the next one is actually Avengers Age of Ultron. I know this one again is probably very surprising, but this movie is my MCU guilty pleasure. This one, along with Doctor Strange, which I'll be talking about later, and Ant-Man probably, to be honest. But those 3 movies are really my guilty pleasure in the MCU, and I think that's why they're ranked so high. I really just love these movies so much, and specifically talking about Age of Ultron, of course, I just think Age of Ultron, my biggest fault with it has to be that it feels like more of an Iron Man movie than an Avengers movie. But other than that, there's really no complaints from me. I love Wanda. I love what they did with Pietro for the time that he was there. I didn't like that they killed him off, but for what he was, I really liked him. Hawkeye was also great in this movie. I feel like this movie was kind of like a predecessor to Civil War in terms of introducing new characters, but still being focused on more or less one main character like Captain America, but also being more of a team movie like in a regular Avengers movie. There's just so much going for Age of Ultron, and I personally just enjoy it out of my heart. But the next one I want to talk about is Black Panther. Now, I could honestly put Black Panther 2 or 3 spots below this, but on rewatch, I still enjoyed it. My biggest fault with Black Panther has to be the fact that it's just such a basic story. It's just someone comes to the kingdom, they feel like they're the righteous king, then they they overthrow the main king, then the king has a comeback story. It's just so basic. But what makes this movie so good to me is, number one, the characterization of T'Challa. I think Chadwick Boseman, rest in peace, is the perfect person to play T'Challa. But other than that, Wakanda is just so well done in this movie. I do like Killmonger as a villain and his connections to Wakanda, as well as Claw. I think Claw is also great. But just speaking about Wakanda alone, I think Wakanda is just really well done, from the visual aspects, and not including the final battle, the visual aspects, just overall the design of the movie, the set designs, just all the action is really, really great. I think this movie is actually really, really good. I just feel like it hinders itself because of such a basic story. Now, next up is Ant-Man 1. I think this movie is really, really good. Again, this is one of my guilty pleasure movies in the MCU. I think this is one of the biggest examples of the MCU where a extremely copycat villain works really well. And I think the biggest reason for that is because of the visuals in this movie. First of all, I think this movie might have the best CGI in the entire MCU, at least for like the grounded movies, because it's just, the scale is so well done in my opinion, and the way that they just shrink everything down. And the final battle in Cassie's little playroom area on the train, all of it's just so cool, and I just really love what they did. And I couldn't stop smiling and laughing in this movie. And again, it's just a basic heist movie like Ant-Man and the Wasp, but what sets it apart for me is, number one, of course, Yellow Jacket. I love Yellow Jacket, but also the characterization of all of the side characters, not just Hank and Hope Pym, but also Ant-Man, Luis, and just the rest of their crew. And overall, it's just also the writing is great in this movie as well. I will say this movie does lack like direction, I guess. It's not a super unique movie like Guardians of the Galaxy, but it's still a super fun movie. And obviously I would put it higher if there was more of a director's flair, but I don't think that's necessary. Now, the next movie on my list is Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, this is very surprising to me as well, just as it might be surprising to you, but my opinion has really changed on this movie, and you guys probably have already seen my Spider-Man Homecoming video. I really like Spider-Man Homecoming now, especially after this watch. This is one of the few MCU movies that I haven't rewatched in full since my initial watch, and my first time rewatching it was during this rewatch. And oh my goodness, is this movie good. It is, in my opinion, the perfect Peter Parker story. I don't think, and I think it's close to a perfect Spider-Man story, but the reason I'm still on the more hate side of the MCU Spider-Man just has to be because of Far From Home. In Homecoming, Peter learns to deal with all this stuff without the tech he has, and then in Far From Home, he gets the tech taken away from him, basically the Edith glasses, but at the same time, he still has all of the Stark tech to make his suits. He still has the Iron Spider suit. He still has a custom Stark suit. There's just so much that Far From Home erases from Homecoming's character that we got, and it's just frustrating to me. But as a movie alone, Homecoming alone, I really do love it. Next up is Doctor Strange. I really like this one. I think, again, the biggest fault comes from Caecilius, but other than that, I think this movie is close to perfect. I love the Ancient One. I also love the backstory of Strange. I love the pacing of this movie, and I also think Caecilius and Dormammu are cool. I just feel like they're really underdeveloped due to the fact that Doctor Strange was a brand new character. Also, the fact that this movie had to completely introduce mystical arts into the MCU. It is a brand new type of world in the MCU that we're getting. They have to explain all of how time works in the MCU in this movie. Had they had to do that, as well as make Doctor Strange a fan favorite character, or a character that everyone cares about. Also, I have Caecilius, Dormammu, basically just regular villain stuff, but most of all, just make Strange intriguing, and I think that's what this movie did for me, and that's why I enjoy it a lot. Nevertheless, I do have to say Doctor Strange is my favorite character in the MCU, so obviously there is a lot of bias to this, but as you can tell, the bias isn't crazy high because it's not even like a top 5 movie for me. Next up on the list is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, the second most recent MCU movie, and I really do love this one. I'll defend this one till the day I die. I think this is actually a really great movie. My biggest complaint, and honestly only complaint with this movie, is how rapidly the tone switches. It switches from a grounded action movie, kind of like the beginning of Winter Soldier, but instead of going to more of just a higher level action at the end like Winter Soldier did, it goes to completely fantastical and mythical, which personally I love, because that's why this movie is so high on my list, because I love those elements. But I just think that the transition wasn't as clean as it should have been. I feel like once they got past like the whole waterfall thing, everything just hit the fan for a second. But I do have to say the villain Wenwu is one of my favorite MCU villains, and overall Shang-Chi is just such a good time. The bus scene is one of my favorite action scenes in the entire MCU, and overall, again, this is just a great movie. Now, next up on the list, and this one is very surprising for me, is Avengers Endgame. I used to hate on this movie a lot, and if you've seen my Avengers Endgame video essay, which if you haven't already checked that out, make sure to click the link in the description down below, because I worked really hard on that video. But I have a very big change of opinion on this movie. I think this movie is actually really, really good. I used to think that the time travel part was really boring, but I disagree with myself now. I think the time travel parts of this movie are when the movie is most interesting. Okay, I take that back. It's like when the movie is like third most interesting out of the 3 acts, but that's still not a bad thing because the other 2 acts are really, really good. The first act shows the grief and just the trauma that Infinity War caused. The second act is obviously the time travel stuff, where we feel like we gain a new knowledge for these characters. We get more context, and it feels like the characters deserve the ending they had due to the time travel part. And I felt like none of that would have felt nearly as satisfying in the third act if it wasn't for the second act. act. And the third act itself is just a masterpiece. You know, it's the best culmination, in my opinion, other than Infinity War. Obviously, it's the best way to bring everyone together after devastating events like Infinity War. Tony Stark's snap, the funeral afterwards, talking about grief with Wanda and Hawkeye, Steve going back to get his last dance with Peggy, everything just adds up and it works really, really well in my opinion. Now, next up on the list is Avengers, and this one, I don't even know where on the list it should be, but I'm so blinded by nostalgia for this movie because it was my first MCU movie in theaters. I had a blast with this one. I saw this one twice in theaters. I used to watch the DVD like every day after school. The filmmaking is cool, action is cool, writing is cool, characters are cool, but it just has a special place in my heart, so I don't really know how to explain it. Nevertheless, I want to move on, and this next one is going to be very surprising for a lot of you, and that one is Eternals. I don't, again, know how to defend this movie, but I'm just going to tell you my straight up thoughts. Again, if you don't like this movie, don't worry about it. I know it has a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I know it's one of the most divisive movies in the entirety of the MCU. I love this movie. I love how it challenges the ideas of humanity. It made me care for 10 characters that I didn't know anything about ahead of time. It characterizes them so well and honestly makes me love a character that wants to kill humans. The stakes that this movie has is unbelievable, and the way that the writing works with all of these different characters and their decisions and their ideals and just all of their thoughts is really cool to me, and I like the way that everything plays out in this movie. Also, the massive scope and scale of this movie is something I really enjoy. You can probably tell from why I like Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings so much is that I love the massive and fantastical side of things, and the final battle for this movie really did that for me. But now getting to my top 5, these are movies I would consider masterclasses from Marvel. If you told me to pick 5 of the best Marvel movies, 5 of the Marvel movies that I would give to someone and tell them that this is all you get to watch in the MCU, make your decision off of these are the 5 movies I would give them. All right, so at number 5 is James Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy. The fact that number 1, this movie just made me cry over a tree dying is what makes it so good. But in all seriousness, I think that making me care for a team of characters that I didn't even know existed before watching this movie, and making me genuinely love every single one of them, and still like connecting to some of their aspects, and just everyone on the team of the Guardians had something that connected to me, which made me enjoy the movie a lot more. Now, one big issue with this movie that a lot of other Marvel movies have is the villain, but in this movie, this is the one time that I will completely excuse it, because the point of this movie, in my opinion, was to care about these characters and come out having a better understanding of these characters. I think that's what an initial team movie is supposed to do, especially when you've never seen these characters before. I think that's also where Eternals really strives. I think Eternals faulted from the fact that there were too many characters, so I couldn't connect with every single one of them. But I think, again, that's where the Guardians flourish. The villain in Guardians is below average, but I still think that the movie's point is not for the villain. They just needed a villain to make it a quote superhero movie, but the point of the movie is for me to care about the heroes, and that's what it did. But in 4th place is Captain America Civil War. I think this movie, like Avengers Infinity War, is top tier because of its writing specifically. The way that it really just sets up the future of the MCU, I guess, without really like doing it super directly. It feels like a contained story in and of itself, but still within itself, it has implications that change the MCU forever. In the moment, you don't really know that when you're watching it for the first time, and so that's why after rewatch, I enjoy this movie a lot more, because I knew after rewatch that they weren't just gonna have these stakes for this one movie and let it all go. They had this whole thing play out through Infinity War, and the whole arc for the team is that they get back together in Endgame to, at the end of the day, save everyone. There is so much that this movie, so not indirectly, but just not super bluntly set up, and that does include characters like Black Panther, Spider-Man. Just there's so much happening in this movie, and it, obviously, in my opinion, it's still a Captain America movie, but it's kind of like the Age of Ultron situation where there is a team here. There is a lot of characters that you have to talk about, and there's a lot of characters they have to develop and make me super interested in, but the main one is Captain America, and in this movie it works. This is one of the movies that solidified Captain America as one of my favorite MCU characters. I still think Captain America is my favorite MCU character, but I guess alive or current Avengers, I would say is Doctor Strange. But my 3rd favorite MCU movie is Thor Ragnarok. I think this is a bit of a cliche one, but I really like this movie. I think it's really good. good. And the biggest complaint that I have with this movie, and honestly, it's my only complaint, that's why it's the biggest one, is that sometimes the comedic aspects of this movie really just undertone the really menacing aspects of Hela. Hela is such an interesting villain, but sometimes she gets really undermined by the comedic aspects. But at the same time, it's like, I don't really take that away from her character because she's still such a badass in the movie. But overall, I think the comedy works for better more than it does for the worse, because it truly revitalized Thor's character. And it's not like it fully impacted his characters, whereas like he doesn't work in anything but comedy anymore. In Infinity War, he was dead serious. In Endgame, he was dead serious. He is dead serious in a lot of Marvel movies now, and I think that Thor Ragnarok really set him up to be a great character in the future, and it really just revitalized his character. If Thor Ragnarok didn't revitalize his character as much as it did, I feel like it would be a bottom half MCU movie, because that's really what carries this one. Also, when Thor lands on the Rainbow Road looking thing and he's singing the immigrant song, oh my goodness, it is gas. Nevertheless, moving on to my second favorite MCU movie, which is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Now, the reason I love this movie so much is because it feels like Mission Impossible, but for superhero movies. And what I mean by this is like, another movie I could compare it to is Black Widow. I'm gonna compare it to Black Widow because I don't care. This movie is 100 million times better than Black Widow because it does every aspect better. The villain, way better. The action sequences in and of themselves feel more real. Obviously, the finale of Winter Soldier is still super up in the air. It's literally in a sky base, but so is Black Widow. But the reason that Winter Soldier works is because there's real emotional tension between the Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, and Captain America. There's real tension and there's, I guess, real care between the two characters. And I think that's why I care about the whole fight more. Whereas in Black Widow, it just feels like Taskmaster is some person that I don't really care about because I really built no connection. But what works so well about Winter Soldier is we see not only connection between Falcon and Captain America, but we also see a better relationship between Natasha and Steve. And I also always am surprised by how well the Zola and Hydra storyline is done. The twist at the end is also very, very well done. And overall, Captain America: Winter Soldier is just a like perfect spy movie. And overall, Captain America: The Winter Soldier just feels like a perfect superhero spy movie. But now for my number one movie in the MCU, my favorite movie that the MCU has ever come out with is Avengers: Infinity War. I think this is easily the number one spot. And honestly, the reason for this is because there are zero complaints I have about this movie. Thanos is great, Captain America is great, Iron Man is great, Wakanda is great, Titan is great, Gamora is great, Nebula is great, all the other characters are great. The way that this movie ties in 10 years worth of movies into one thing is absolutely phenomenal. Guardians of the Galaxy meet Thor, then Guardians of the Galaxy meet Tony Stark. Doctor Strange is solidified as one of my favorite MCU characters in this movie alone. The emotional weight is 100% there throughout the entirety of the movie because you can feel like there's real stakes. This is 100% a Thanos solo movie and I love it. Even though he only has 30 minutes of screen time, it works. The ending is absolutely phenomenal. I don't have much else to say about Avengers: Infinity War. I said a lot of it in my Avengers: Infinity War rewatch review. I literally titled it the best MCU movie because I think it is. I think it is a masterpiece. I think it is perfect. But that's basically it for this video, guys. If you guys enjoyed my official MCU ranking, make sure to drop a like rating down below. In the comments down below, let me know your top 10 MCU movies. But yeah, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.